Good evening, fight fans. This is the Radulich and Broadcasting History of Heavyweight Championship Boxing Series. We are on Chapter 11, entitled Forgotten Sons. Yes.
And it's ironic that we're on Chapter 11 because the talent here is largely bankrupt.
Ha ha ha. First, I'm your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. And if I sound a little weird tonight, it's because I had my wisdom teeth removed, and I'm kind of pushing through that. But that's okay. I'm doped up on all kinds of painkillers and Tylenol and whatnot. We're going to get through this. And carrying me on his back tonight is the punchy pugilist and the man with all the facts about boxing. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Well, I didn't have my wisdom teeth pulled out. I did suffer a grade 2 ankle sprain, and I don't have painkillers, so I'm a little bit jealous.
That's okay. They didn't give me anything good. I asked for, today I asked for Vicodin. They gave me Tylenol.
Wow. Oof.
Yeah.
That's like asking for Muhammad Ali and getting Greg Page.
Hey, it's funny you should mention that. Tonight, folks, we're going to be talking about the period of heavyweight boxing between 1979 and 1986. It's the Forgotten Sons period. It is we're looking for a hero, and every time we put one up, that hero gets shot in the head. Not literally. This isn't the '60s Contra Revolution. But yeah, well, a few of them do. But basically, Pat, and you can break it down for me here, from Ali to Tyson, the world of boxing is looking for the next great heavyweight contender. And the titles are fractured. We have the WBA, the WBC, and the IBF. And then sooner or later we'll get to the WBO, but that's a story for another day. And the WBA is the worst game of hot potato you're ever going to see in your life. The WBC is not as bad. Then you have Michael Spinks, which is his whole other story. And then finally we have the IBF. Now, from Ali to Tyson, when Tyson cleans this all up, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. This period of not being able to find an undisputed champion, a lot of potential fighters being shot down when given their opportunities, a lot of missed opportunities. Pat, the period from Ali's third retirement, when he vacated the WBA title, to when Tyson starts winning his titles in '86, how would you characterize this period in boxing?
Oof. Not good, because more often than not, and really realistically up until this point in history, always your biggest star was your heavyweight champion of the world. And there could be some great fighters underneath there, people like Sugar Ray Robinson at middleweight and welterweight. You know, your middleweight and welterweight stars of those eras, Roberto Duran in the 70s who came about. But they never really eclipsed the idea of the heavyweight champion. And we see a twofold problem here. One is the fracturing of the championship going in all kinds of directions where people genuinely don't know who the heavyweight champion is. And two, a distinct just lack of upper-level ability possessed by a lot of these guys whose careers and reigns are going to be marred by inconsistency, and as a result, they get shown up by these incredible fighters at lighter weight classes like Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns, and of course Sugar Ray Leonard through this era of time, because those guys were all marvelous and consistent and top of their game, and these guys really weren't.
Our story is going to begin tonight with the fallout from Ali's retirement in July 27th of 1979. We're going to attempt to make our first star here, Big John Tate. He was supposed to be the next heavyweight star. He won the WBA title from Jerry Coetzee on October 20th, 1979. Tell us about Jerry Coetzee and John Tate, and why John Tate was supposed to be the next big star.
Big John was an American Olympian from Tennessee, and he was really the guy who they looked at as, man, this guy's big, he's athletic, he's got that Olympic pedigree, being from that same team as Ray Leonard and the Spinks brothers. this is going to be our guy that we can bank on to carry the banner and be the next big star. And Tate had a lot of attributes that were positive, as the name implies. He was a big guy. He was 6'4". You know, he had good punching power. When he went to the Olympics, the guy he lost to, he wound up being a big disappointment because he lost to Teofilo Stevenson. But that was when Stevenson won his third consecutive heavyweight gold medal for Cuba. So it wasn't too demeaning to have lost to the very best at the time. And, you know, there was a lot of hope because he knocked out a few guys along the way who people held in some regard. Dwayne Bobbick, who had been a contender, a heavy puncher from South America named Bernardo Mercado, and another South African, Kali Gnutzi. And then when they got into a title fight with Jerry Coetzee, they did it in South Africa, which was very controversial because obviously there was still this thing called apartheid happening there where separation of the races was ongoing. And Coetzee was white and John Tate was black. And they did it before 80,000 people in that fight. And John came on and won the fight and claimed his portion of the heavyweight title with a 15-round decision over Coetzee, who at this point was known as a great right-hand puncher, but had a tendency to fade late in fights that wound up costing him, and such was the case here. And the thought at that point was, okay, well, John has claimed this vacant title while we left the WBC title last we spoke with Larry Holmes for a period of time before he vacates that. So Tate is seen as a guy who potentially is the successor to Ali, and he's a little more charismatic than Larry, a little more well-spoken. And again, he's big, he's photographs well. There's a thought that this is going to be a guy we can promote into a star as long as he can keep up this success level. And there we are.
So he goes from winning the WBA title and goes into his first defense against Mike Weaver. Now, who is Mike Weaver, and why was Mike Weaver supposed to lose this fight?
We actually spoke about Mike Weaver briefly on our show about Larry Holmes, where Mike was a guy who got a title shot against Larry Holmes in a fight that people didn't take seriously, to the point that the big three networks didn't even bid on the fight to air it, and it wound up being one of the first heavyweight title fights airing on HBO. And Weaver had a very undistinguished record of 19-9 at the time, and wound up giving Holmes a real competitive fight that opened people's eyes and said, maybe there's something to this kid. And he's best known for having a physique that may have been the best ever in the heavyweight division, barring Evander Holyfield. But he was also a good fighter, and that record belied that he was matched up very tough very early in his career. And he was able to forge some good skills out of that period of time. And since he's lost to Larry Holmes, he hasn't lost a fight since. And you know, that includes victories over includes a victory over Scott Ledoux, who is a very tough guy and a known contender who's gone in there with a lot of guys. And he beat Scott in Scott's backyard of Minnesota, and he looked real good doing it. He scored a quick knockout of Harry Terrell, who will later go on to be a trial horse for Mike Tyson and Tommy Morrison. And so the thought is that they can have a big homecoming fight for Tate in Tennessee against a known commodity who would fight a style that would complement what John Tate did well.
So I watched this fight. This is one of the ones you sent me. And this goes for a good long time. I mean, Tate is handling Mike Weaver. But then Mike Weaver hits him with, what was it, an uppercut? That took John Tate's soul. I mean, this is one of the most vicious knockouts you'll ever see in boxing. He hit John Tate one time, and John Tate fell over like a tree. It was amazing. That took place on March 31st, 1980.
With seconds left?
Yeah, with seconds left. I think it was what was it, in the 15th round?
It was in the very last round where he was hopelessly behind. He had one real strong round in the 10th, but that was it, and he had pretty much lost almost every other round besides that. And from the depth of defeat, he snatched victory.
And so your new WBA heavyweight champion, Mike Weaver. And so ends the Cinderella story of John Tate. John Tate will go on and have some victories, and he'll have some losses, but he'll also struggle with drug addiction and other issues and kind of fade out of existence in the world of boxing. However, Mike Weaver is going to go on to fight Michael Dokes for the WBA heavyweight title on December 10th, 1982. Now tell us about old crazy hair Michael Dokes.
So, I mentioned our friend Harry Coetzee before. In between fighting Tate and Dokes, Weaver actually racks up a successful defense against Harry Coetzee in Botswana in South Africa, where again Coetzee starts very strong and fades late, and Weaver knocks him out. He gets a defense over Quick Tillis, who is later on known best for being the first guy to take Mike Tyson the distance. And then we run into Michael Dokes, who's a really talented fighter out of Akron, Ohio, best known for having really quick hands. And as an amateur, he was someone who's very highly thought of and was supposed to go to the Olympics, but he wound up losing in the trials to John Tate. And, you know, Dokes was always a case of someone who they thought had a lot of potential because he wound up fighting in a televised exhibition in 1977 with Muhammad Ali. And Ali didn't take it seriously, clowned a lot, but everybody had their eye on Dokes with these fast hands and good reflexes. And he wound up beating Jimmy Young, who we talked about, knocked out Ossie Ocasio, and people were looking at him as like, this could be our next successor. And sure enough, he gets a shot at Mike Weaver for the WBA title. And there's a lot of controversy about this because just a couple weeks before this fight, Ray Boom Boom Mancini had fought a Korean fighter named Duk-Koo Kim for the WBA lightweight title. And it was a very punishing back-and-forth fight, and after 14 rounds, Mancini knocked out Kim, but unfortunately due to injuries sustained in that fight, Kim wound up dying. And it caused a lot of reshuffling and shaping and thinking in boxing because it had aired on live national TV. And so the referee in that fight, Richard Green, wound up committing suicide because of the guilt he felt. And things were in a very precarious position. So prior to this fight, the referee in charge was basically told, you do not let this go too long like that did. You stop this as soon as you see fit to. And so they'll have their fight on December 10th, and Dokes hurts Weaver early and drops him and jumps on him. And even though Weaver's not really out of it, the fight stopped because of the circumstances that surrounded that with the Ray Mancini Duk-Koo Kim tragedy.
Yeah, it's a very controversial ending to the fight. In light of the tragedy with Duk-Koo Kim, you can see where the referee is gun-shy. On the other hand, he doesn't really give Weaver much of a chance, and Weaver is pissed. You know, Weaver is, just to give you an idea of what's happening, Dokes is wailing on him, but Weaver is pecking a lot of them off with his arms. He's covering up. He's not getting cleanly hit. And, you know, he's leaning up against the corner, and he's, you know, absorbing a lot of hits to the arms, like I said. And then the ref's like, you're done. You're not defending yourself. The fight's over. And afterwards, like, there's an explosion. You know, Mike Weaver is trying to compose himself. His corner is pissed. This is, you know, this was the very definition of controversial.
Yeah, so because of the nature of that, there's a rematch ordered, and that's also in Nevada. And this one goes the distance in a very sluggish fight. But most people who saw it thought that Weaver had done enough to win that fight, only for it to go to a majority draw, and Dokes wound up retaining his championship.
Which brings us back to our man, good old Jerry Coetzee from South Africa. And they would have a fight, Michael Dokes and Jerry Coetzee, for the WBA heavyweight title on September 23rd, 1983. So what happens in that fight, Pat?
This time Coetzee doesn't fight in South Africa, and he wins. Because his prior two title shots had taken place in his native country, and he wound up losing both of them. This time they fought in Dokes' backyard in Richfield, Ohio, which is not far from his home in Akron. And basically the knock on Coetzee, like we said, was always he didn't have any stamina, but he kept applying pressure to Weaver to Dokes in this fight. and kept coming forward, kept breaking him down, and kept looking for a home for that right hand, which was called the bionic right hand because he had surgery on it so many times and how many times he had it repaired. And finally, after that, Dokes fades and fades and fades, and Coetzee wounds up pretty much shocking the world and knocking him out in the 10th round in front of his hometown crowd and becoming the first white fighter since Ingemar Johansson in 1960 to claim a piece of a heavyweight championship. And what's very interesting about this time is now you have the WBA and WBC champions are Larry Holmes and Harry Coetzee. Coetzee and Holmes were actually in negotiation to unify the title again for a fight that would have taken place in South Africa. What happened was Holmes at the time had very big misgivings about dealing with Don King, who was the promoter of record for Coetzee, and didn't want to do that again. And also, every time they tried to put it together, the money kept falling through. So that fight ultimately never came about, and we wouldn't see title unifications of any kind for some time after this.
All right, so I mentioned hot potato, and boy does it get hot. Coetzee loses in his first defense in South Africa to Greg Page. Pat, who's
Why
Greg?
didn't he learn not to fight in South Africa?
Yeah, really. Tell everyone who Greg Page is.
Greg Page was a former sparring partner of Muhammad Ali as an amateur. Beaten a lot of highly touted amateurs through the 70s. Again, another guy with a lot of potential, but wasn't seen the same way as guys like Michael Dokes and John Tate because he didn't have that same high level of international amateur pedigree that they did. But he was from Ali's hometown in Louisville, and he wound up fighting some decent guys on the way up, and he kind of shocked everybody when he knocked out Alfredo Evangelista in 2 rounds because Page wasn't known as a super heavy-handed guy, but he'd be a very durable guy who had gone 15 with Ali not long before that, had challenged and gone a good number of rounds with Larry Holmes. And he's somebody who had flown pretty well under the radar because he had taken some losses along the way. He had lost to Trevor Berbick after Berbick had beaten John Tate. He lost to Ronaldo Mr. Snipes. He lost to terrible Tim Witherspoon, who we'll talk about in his first attempt at winning a title for the WBC title in a largely lackluster decision. And he lost to David Bay right before he fought Harry Coetzee. So the thought is that Coetzee is going to do to Page the same thing that the other guys had done because he's taking this fight after 2 consecutive losses. And again, we talk about the maddening inconsistency that surrounds this era. They go to South Africa and Page stops Coetzee in 8 rounds to take the title.
So now Greg Page is your WBA heavyweight championship, and he fights Tony Tubbs in his first defense. And hey, what happens here? He loses it to Tony Tubbs. Who's Tony Tubbs, Pat?
Well, as his name may imply, Tony was a slightly overweight guy, but he had tremendous attributes. We talked about the hand speed of Dokes. Tony Tubbs may have had faster hands than Michael Dokes, which is crazy to think about. He had a very decorated international amateur pedigree. In fact, as an amateur, the only guy who really ever gave him real trouble consistently was Marvis Frazier, who was, the son of Joe Frazier. And Tubbs was actually the heavyweight favorite to go to the Olympic Games in 1980, but of course the United States boycotted those games, so he didn't get to participate. He had kind of seen some high-level stuff at a very young age by being the chief sparring partner to Ali for Ali's rematch with Leon Spinks. And for Tony, his biggest enemy had always been his work ethic, but to this point, he's still a hungry young fighter climbing up the ranks, beating a young Bone Crusher Smith, Jerry Williams, Jimmy Young, and he had an undefeated record when he got the opportunity to go fight Greg Page for the WBA title, and sure enough, he goes ahead and wins it.
All right, and then he moves on to face terrible Tim Witherspoon, who, of course, he loses to. Terrible Tim Witherspoon becomes the first
You
guy...
guys seeing a pattern here?
Yeah. Terrible Tim Witherspoon becomes the first guy to record a successful against this title against Britain's Frank Bruno. That occurred on July 19th, 1986 for the WBA heavyweight title. Tell us about Frank Bruno versus Tim Witherspoon.
It's one of the better fights that we get out of the guys of this era, which I don't know how much that's saying, but Bruno was Britain's real favorite heavyweight for a long time, and a guy who was thought to really be their best chance to regain a heavyweight championship as a fighter of British origin. Hadn't held one in nearly 100 years to this point. And so there was a lot of hype and hope around Frank Bruno. And Witherspoon was seen as a guy who, even though he'd been in there with Larry Holmes and pushed him to the limit, and had held now both the WBC title and WBA title at different points, he was seen as very beatable, and that this was the opportunity where Frank was going to just make things right and become the first British champion in forever. To this point, Bruno's only lost to Bone Crusher Smith in an upset, but he's rebounded strong. He's won, like 7 fights in a row since then over good competition. Anders Eklund, Harry Coetzee in 1 round, which is really what got him the shot. And he starts strong against Witherspoon in Wembley and really carries the fight for a little while before Witherspoon starts timing him and getting that big overhand right in, followed by his left hook. And eventually Bruno just can't hang with that constant pressure and fades, and Witherspoon will stop him in the 11th round to, shockingly enough, retain a championship. Although what shouldn't be shocking is this took place in Bruno's backyard of Wembley Stadium, which again is showing you guys that if you're a heavyweight in the 80s, don't fight in your hometown.
So if you're keeping score, John Tate, October 20th, 1979. Mike Weaver, March 31st, 1980. Michael Dokes, December 10th, 1982. Jerry Coetzee, September 23rd, 1983. Greg Page, December 1st, 1984. Tony Tubbs, April 29th, 1985. Terrible Tim Witherspoon, January 17th, 1986. Which takes us to Tim Witherspoon versus James Bone Crusher Smith in a rematch for Witherspoon's WBA heavyweight title on December 12th, 1986. And wouldn't you know who won the pony? James Bone Crusher Smith defeats Terrible Tim Witherspoon. And he will be the last of our WBA Forgotten Sons before the Thanos of boxing in this era comes to clean house, which is Mike Tyson.
Wouldn't you know who won the pony? Goddamn.
So tell us about this rematch on December 12th of 1986. After literally nearly one guy per year having the title up to this point, how does it all end here with James Bone Crusher Smith and Terrible Tim Witherspoon in the rematch?
Well, not to take all the credit away from Bone Crusher, who could punch and was fighting the best guys available at the time. If you look at his ledger up until his win over Tim Witherspoon, David Bay, former world title challenger, Jesse Ferguson, future world title challenger, Mike Weaver, former world champion, Marvis Frazier, title challenger, Witherspoon, prior to this, world champion twice, Jose Ribalta, world title challenger, Tony Tubbs, former champion, Larry Holmes, former champion, Frank Bruno, future champion. That's a lot of the better guys of this era all in a row for Bone Crusher. So maybe he didn't have the prettiest record at the time going into this fight. He was 19-5, but he was fighting the best guys available, so we can't really slight him for that. And on top of that, he had already fought Tim and lost to him. So going into this, there's that motivation to do that. And Tim, on the other side, is fighting a protracted legal battle with his promoter, Don King, and his manager, Carl King, who had at this point, according to Witherspoon, pocketed in excess of about $20 million of his purses that should have gone to him, and that they were violating antitrust laws, with Carl being Don's son, of course, working as the manager while Don is the promoter, the amount of money they were taking from his purses, their papering of his expenses that they were paying for, allegedly. So it wound up being a long, protracted legal battle, and Witherspoon admits readily that he didn't have his head in the fight at this point. On top of that, Bone Crusher is a late replacement for, I believe at the time, who was supposed to be Tony Tubbs in a rematch. And if you've watched both these guys fight, they fight very differently. Bone Crusher, as the name implies, is going in there to look for power punches and to try to stop you, whereas Tubbs is much slicker and looking to box you, use angles, and defensive movement. So cards were kind of against him in this one, and sure enough, that's how it played out, because he done got jumped at the opening bell and was never in this fight after the first knockdown.
The WBA title will be won by Mike Tyson in March 7th of 1987. We will get there in our next podcast. So for now ends the story of the WBA hot potato. For a brief moment in time, let's talk about the WBC Heavyweight Championship. In March of June 9th, 1978, Larry Holmes becomes the WBC Heavyweight Champion. Holmes then vacates the title after a dispute with Don King over the proposed purser's fight against mandatory challenger Greg Page. That happens on December 11th, 1983. They then make a fight from March 9th, 1984, between Terrible Tim and the aforementioned Greg Page, which Tim Witherspoon wins the WBC title. And your next WBC heavyweight champion is Pinklin Thomas. Pinklin Thomas shows up everywhere during this era, fighting everybody, including Mike Tyson. Who is Pinklin Thomas, and why is he so important in history?
Well, Pink was the first heavyweight champion not named Muhammad Ali or Jimmy Young, trained by Angelo Dundee. And really, out of everybody from this generation, I think more people point to him than anybody as the guy who had the most potential to really be a great heavyweight. And it's because of a lot of things. Thomas had one of the best jabs you'd ever see in a heavyweight. He really just extended that range of it well and could punch really well behind it. He was 6'3". He moved like a guy like Ali. I won't say he moves like Ali, but he moved in the vein of Ali, where he was a big guy but light on his feet with great balance and great athleticism. And he really looked to have all the tools. He could take a punch when he was hit. He could punch behind his jab. He had stamina. But he also had this other thing hovering over his head called crack cocaine addiction. And ultimately, that wound up being what really took years off of his career. And it's a shame because, again, he comes in and fights Witherspoon and really puts on a great performance in a tough fight against as good a version of Witherspoon as you'll see, and beats him clean and fair over 12 rounds to take his belt away. And he really just put on a show. He fights another former champion, Mike Weaver, who we've seen a couple times show up, and he knocks Weaver out because after criticisms of his punching power against Witherspoon, he goes and makes a statement by knocking out the very tough Weaver. And then he doesn't fight again for almost a year, where he's doing stints in rehab and God knows what else. And that clears the way for a Canadian fighter named Trevor Berbick, who had seen some press and success in his past. He had fought Larry Holmes, but he's probably best known at this point as the guy who had Ali's last fight that he won by decision. And, in that time, he's had some weird fights where he's able to beat guys like Greg Page and he can beat Mitch Green, but he loses to guys like Ronaldo Snipes and S.T. Gordon, which was really considered a big upset at the time, because S.T. Gordon was a cruiserweight, and that was seen as a huge upset. So when he winds up getting his shot at Pinklin Thomas, he's really only fought two guys who had any kind of significance, which were David Bay, who really made his reputation more than anything by losing to Larry Holmes, and Mitch Green, who really made his reputation for being an unstable nut. And those are his two big wins over that time. He didn't look particularly impressive in either of them, but that's enough to get him the shot at Thomas, who, unbeknownst to the people who are unaware of his, terrible crack cocaine addiction, is a strong favorite to win. And unfortunately for Thomas, between that and Berbick really preparing himself as best he could, he lost a 12-round decision. And that, combined with pretty much everything else going on outside of his life, is the end of Pink as a potential guy who could be a great heavyweight.
So as you just said, Trevor Berbick becomes the WBC heavyweight champion on March 22nd, 1986. He will lose his belt to Mike Tyson. Second verse, same as the first.
A little bit nastier, a little bit worse.
So ends our story of the WBC heavyweight championship. Pat, tell us about the IBF sanctioning body. They started certifying world champions in 17 different weight classes since 1983. The very first heavyweight champion for the IBF is Larry Holmes. How did this come about? Where did it come from? Why do we need the IBF if we have the WBA and the WBC?
We didn't, but that's another story. Basically, at this point in time, the WBA is based largely in Panama, with moves to Venezuela happening very shortly after this, and the WBC is based in Mexico. There's been allegations at this point in time in 1983 that the WBC is largely showing favoritism towards Don King promoted fighters, and that the WBA is showing favoritism towards Latino fighters. So there's a lot of questioning as to their practices and how they calculate their ratings, etc. Eventually, out of New Jersey, there was a sanctioning body called the USBA, the United States Boxing Association, that had served as underneath the WBC and WBA as a regional championship for American fighters. And at the head of that was formerly a New Jersey commissioner named Robert Lee. What they decided to do was create their own world-recognized sanctioning body, promoting that they were going to do business fair and correctly, and etc. The irony of this is later on in the 1990s, they would be the first body indicted for being proven to have accepted bribes to alter their rankings and things of that nature. Largely because they were operating in America, and America actually goes out of their way to prosecute these things, whereas in Mexico and Panama and Venezuela, they really don't care. So that's why we got the IBF. And part of their process was any champion in any weight division that was already undisputed as recognized by the WBA and WBC, like Marvin Hagler in the middleweight division, the IBF gave recognition to. In the case of Larry Holmes, the IBF hadn't recognized the heavyweight champion at the time Larry was reigning as WBC champion. When Larry got basically fed up of the politics involving Don King and WBC president Jose Sulaiman and dumped their title, the IBF said to Larry, hey, we'll recognize you as our heavyweight champion. It'll give us instant credibility as a sanctioning body because everybody knows you're the real heavyweight champion of the world, and then you've still got a championship belt to carry around and promote yourself with. And that was agreed upon by both parties, and Larry winds up losing recognition as both the IBF and the lineal heavyweight champion to Michael Spinks, who we covered in our last episode about Larry. And so the IBF, in kind of a very shrewd business move, basically got themselves recognized as the title associated with the actual heavyweight champion of the world, which in certain instances will give you more credibility than would others.
So Michael Spinks becomes the IBF champion, heavyweight champion, on September 21st, 1985. However, he was stripped of that title on February 26, 1987, for refusing to fight mandatory challenger Tony Tucker. Pat, who's Tony Tucker?
Tony Tucker is another heavyweight contender of the time who, on paper, seemed to have a lot to offer. He was big, he was strong, he could punch, had good hand speed, had a good amateur pedigree, had been to international competition. At the Pan American Games, he actually won a gold medal. So there was thought that he could be somebody, and was one of the guys signed to the NBC Tomorrow's Champions program, where he was featured regularly on undercards of bigger fights. And he's able to beat some really good guys on the underneath there. He beats Eddie the Animal Lopez by a knockout, and while Eddie was never seen as a top guy, he was seen as a very tough guy who was difficult to stop, and he was able to do that. He took on the durable Jimmy Young, who had played spoiler to a lot of guys, and beat him by a decision. Knocked out Dave Jaco, and the big one was he won a unanimous decision over James Broadaxe Broad, and that reeled up Tucker to 33-0, which, when we're talking about an era of no consistency, a young, good, talented heavyweight who can get to 33-0 is really, really very impressive. And he's doing it against good opposition, and why not give him a shot at this point? Because he's probably earned it with everybody else not being able to reel off more than 4 straight wins in a row at the top level of the heavyweight division.
So, with the title stripped, they need to recognize a new champion, and a title fight is made between Tony Tucker, as we just mentioned, and a man you may remember, a man who lives in infamy for defeating Iron Mike Tyson in Tokyo, Japan, but that's a story for another day. Ladies and gentlemen, James Buster Douglas. Before James Buster Douglas lived in infamy by defeating Mike Tyson in Tokyo, Japan, who was James Buster Douglas?
Buster was a guy who was seen as a heavyweight with good tools, but not the total package the same way Tony Tucker was seen as. And largely the biggest knock on Buster was that he just didn't want it as bad as other guys because his conditioning was always suspect. And that may never have been more prevalent than in his fight with Tony Tucker, where Buster got out to a great start and was in control of the fight behind his beautiful jab and working very hard and landing good combinations. And Tucker had his moments here or there, but really what we see is in the 8th round, Buster just looks like he's run out of gas and doesn't really offer much in the way of opposition. In the 9th, he barely throws any punches. And in the 10th, even though he's not hurt, Tucker's just unloading on him and facing no opposition in return. And they wind up stopping the fight. And Buster is a guy at this point who's seen as all potential and no realization because this fight really underscored what his career had been at the time. After this, he's going to be 23-4-1, which is not a super distinguished record. And he'd had some losses to guys who people felt maybe he should have been able to beat, like Mike White and Jesse Ferguson. And mix that in with some good competition here and there that he was able to beat. But Buster just largely was a guy who was unimpressive and not seen as a serious threat because it was perceived he didn't take things seriously. And that's not necessarily wrong.
So, our story of the IBF World Champions up to this point is going to lead where all roads have led so far. Tony Tucker will face Mike Tyson on August 1st, 1987, and he will lose that fight and that belt. Mike Tyson will start to be in the conversation for the undisputed world champion, heavyweight world champion. Now, there's going to be a fight that we need to talk about in our next chapter with Michael Spinks, but we'll get there. In the meantime, we have 7 champions, 2 title defenses, and 1 successful. At this point, Michael Spinks, who was stripped of the IBF championship, is still the lineal champion. Okay, he's never, nobody ever beat the man who beat the man. Spinks makes his, Spinks,
he ends up.
Yeah, he ends up, sorry, I lost my place. The IBF then strips Spinks of recognition because Spinks would accept a $5 million payday to fight Jerry Cooney instead of less money to fight number 1 contender Tony Tucker. So that's that. Which leaves us to this point. At this point, our 4 champions are WBA, Bone Crusher Smith, WBC, Trevor Berbick, IBF, Tony Tucker, and lineal Michael Spinks. That's where we are when Tyson emerges and starts collecting belts. Inconsistent is one way to describe this era. Disappointing. nearly killed the heavyweight division as far as money and interest. It's been written that if Tyson doesn't come along when he does, the heavyweight division may just be a desert landscape of nothing going on and nobody wanting to pay for any significant fights. Tyson and then Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe will save this division and revitalize it. But from 79 to 86 is a period of unsure, just who knew what was going to happen next, and you couldn't bet on anything, Pat. I'll give you the final word here.
Yeah, there's a reason this is looked at as arguably the worst period of heavyweight boxing that there's ever been. And I don't necessarily disagree. You had guys who had ability and talent and a lot of things behind them and either weren't willing to put the work in, were disrupted by the politics of sanctioning bodies and promoters, or the big looming problem over most of the 80s, one word, drugs, drugs, where a lot of these guys who we've talked about wound up having very severe drug problems living the high life. Among the guys we talked openly about Pinklin Thomas actually having these issues while he was heavyweight champion of at least the WBC version. He's not the only one. A lot of these guys wound up having very bad drug issues, including Michael Dokes and Tony Tubbs, among others. And it's really sad that they had all this potential and really wasted it and never saw the fruits of their labor realized as much as they could be because of these things. And that's why, as a result, we never see any of them do anything really significant because of this. And between things like multiple failed drug tests, poor training habits, fights with promoters, that and the splitting of the titles really did in a lot of the interest in heavyweight boxing. In the 70s, we really did see more division amongst champions emerge with the WBA and the WBC, but they were also more willing to reunify those titles repeatedly. Carlos Monzon reunified the middleweight title against Rodrigo Valdez, who held the WBC version. Roberto Duran reunified the lightweight championship when he took the WBC title from Esteban de Jesus in their rubber match of their epic rivalry. In the 80s, those fights just didn't happen all that commonly, and as a result, that helped kill interest as well. Then you add into the mix a third sanctioning body, and then on top of that third sanctioning body that withdraws recognition of a champion, then you have a guy who's never actually lost his titles but doesn't have a physical belt but is still the man who beat the man who beat the man. How are people supposed to pay attention, keep track, not lose interest? And it says a lot when, a 33-0 heavyweight named Tony Tucker, who appears to be the real deal on paper, doesn't generate as much income for Michael Spinks to fight as does Jerry Cooney, who has taken 2 fights in the prior 5 years to that fight. It's a lost generation of guys for a reason. A lot of these guys are forgotten because they never made enough of an impact to be remembered in the first place. And while there's talent here, a lot of these guys are going to be remembered more than anything for their losses to the eventual greats of the division who came in, stepped up, and made their presence felt and known, like Mike Tyson, like Evander Holyfield, like Lennox Lewis, like Riddick Bowe, and even lesser guys on that scale, like Tommy Morrison or Ray Mercer, are going to be guys who went in there with these folks and beat them. And ultimately, their legacy is not a good one because you're seen as part of a time when boxing had more visibility than ever, where it was on all 3 big networks of the time, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and HBO and Showtime, and none of you were able to get an interest going in what has primarily been the heaviest marketed and profitable division in boxing, the heavyweight division, and you were outshone by stars throughout all the lighter divisions. We mentioned, the Fab Four of Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran, but even guys like Alexis Arguello and Ray Mancini and lighter weight fighters became TV stars because of their crowd-pleasing style and, again, level of excellence and consistency. And the heavyweights didn't have any of that. And that's why the 80s, when you talk about that, when you talk about great heavyweights, largely the first name that comes up is Mike Tyson. And he wasn't even there until the second half of the decade. Whereas, other guys like Bobby Chacon and Cornelius Boza Edwards were thrilling guys in lighter divisions, and Julio Cesar Chavez was rising up, and the 84 Olympians were making their pro debuts. And that's why these guys they weren't special. And when you have the heavyweight division and nobody there is special, there's a real scary period of time for anybody involved in the sport, because it could mean bad things. And ultimately it did for a while, up until Iron Mike came in and, as you called him, Thanos, reclaimed all the gems and put them on the gauntlet.
What do you think happens to boxing in the heavyweight division in the latter half of the 80s if Mike Tyson never shows up?
You'd like to say that there would have been somebody eventually who came in and kind of cleaned house the way he did. But again, let's look at the landscape. Evander Holyfield doesn't become a heavyweight until 1989. So that's an additional 3 years of this going on, potentially. Lennox Lewis doesn't turn pro until 1989, and that's just him becoming a professional. Riddick Bowe in 1988, again, just becoming a professional. So there's a very good chance that we suffer through a significant amount of more placeholders and not top-level guys just playing hot potato with these belts and really killing a lot of interest in what could have potentially been a disaster area for heavyweight boxing, and as a result, boxing in general.
It does reframe Mike Tyson, doesn't it? I mean, I don't want to talk too much about him because he's getting his own show next month. But, Mike Tyson, known for his out-of-the-ring legal troubles, various prison stints, mental illness. But he's the guy that saved heavyweight boxing. As you said, without him, the 80s are lost. No, as you said, Riddick Bowe, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis don't really start to come on until the 90s.
Yeah, and it was desperately needed because, and not only in the sense that we needed an identifiable singular champion, but we also needed somebody who could just excite people. Because you watch these fights, a lot of these fights are not very good. A lot of these fights, and we watched some of the better ones of the time, they're still not all that great, especially when you compare it to what we've been watching up to this point. There's a noticeable drop-off in the level of excitement and energy and drama in these fights versus their predecessors.
All right, Pat, I think that's as good a place to end it as any. The aforementioned Mike Tyson gets his own show next month, November 18th, barring any unforeseen medical or mental health issues between the two of us. We will record on November 18th, Chapter 12, The Life and Times of Mike Tyson, the savior of heavyweight boxing in the 80s. In the meantime, this is actually the first podcast I've done this week. Tomorrow, I'm going to try to get 2 done. We're going to do the Betty Page Halloween specials, and we'll look at the second Yorn Heavy Rock Radio Executing the Classics. Last week, we looked at Lucifer, Devil in the Gateway, the Lucifer TV show. We looked at the first Heavy Rock Radio by Yorn, and myself and Robert Winfrey looked at The Babadook. And that was while I was still on lots of painkillers. So that's a fun show to listen to. So we hope you all check that out. The following week, we've got a lot of shows, and assuming my jaw holds up, we'll get through them all. We've got The Death of Hawkman, Hell in the Cell, The Empty Man, The Witches, Danzig Sings Elvis,
Oh, good lord.
The Craft Legacy, and NXT Halloween Havoc.
Wait, what's the Craft Legacy? Did they make a sequel to the Craft?
They sure did, Bunky.
Boy, that's terrible. Is Nev Campbell in it?
I don't think so. I'd have to look.
Boy, that's terrible.
Yes, sir. All right. Are you recording with anybody else? You got anything going on?
No.
Terrific. All right, Pat. This has been fun trying to unscramble the post Ali. This is the second post Ali scramble. We had the one where he had to vacate his title because of Nam, and then we had this one because of retirement. My goodness, Ali causing nothing but havoc in the heavyweight division. All right, that takes it for Chapter 11 in our history of heavyweight boxing. For Pat Mullin, I'm Mark Radulich. Be well, be safe, and behave.